There's going to be some interesting rambling because I'm on like cumulative 8 hours of sleep for the past 3 days. So if I like freeze for a moment or something, like Jared will just, he knows to throw something at me. So.
Got you covered, man.
Real quick about me. Enough of that. I'm going to throw the typical stuff in here that, and the only reason I do this is because as we're talking about exploiting systems that are designed to keep us safe and provide information that, for the reality is that these systems are incredibly awesome things. You know, when it comes to tornado warnings and weather alerts and all these types of things, sometimes we get a little bit annoyed with them, but they save lives. And ultimately, they're designed to keep us safe. And so I kind of throw this in here and throw that out because in reality, wow, amazingly, now I'm getting trolled, so fun. But the issues with these systems are very egregious. And so some of these systems were initially conceived, 50, 60 years ago. And just like IoT and Internet of Things and some of the other talks we've heard, what's the value in exploiting them? What's the point of sitting here on stage and just blowing them out of the water and all that type of stuff? It's not an issue of showing like, ooh, look at me, I've got some awesome exploit, or I found all these bad vulnerabilities in this. Really, the motivation to do this, and I'll throw this out there, like for the past 2 years that I've spoken here have been about blue team and defensive technologies and things like that, and how do we improve it. And so this particular talk and the talk that preceded it that I gave at Hacker Halted and a few other conferences that focused on exploiting the emergency notification systems from the context of RF and radio frequencies and that type of stuff. These particular sets of vulnerabilities are really about, and I'm already having one of those moments like where I'm like, what was I even going to say? Yep, throw something at me. Woohoo! But the point in this is not to just like, do a little root dance or something like that. It's really to try to motivate the people that are designing these systems, that are implementing these systems, to understand that there is long-lasting impact and there's a lot at stake in this. And when I've spoken with them, the earliest disclosures that I did with on vulnerabilities that I had found over 5 years ago were pretty much the authorities were like, so what? Nobody would do that or whatever. And we'll talk about here in a little bit that obviously anybody familiar with some of the exploits of this system, some of the news that's happened about this, we'll talk about it in a little bit. So here's a little bit of the background, and I'll provide there's some articles and other things, and this is a link back to the talk that I gave. It's called Zombies on the Airwaves. And if you hit that, I know that's kind of a long thing, but if you go to my blog, pentestfail.com, you can kind of see some of the links and the other stuff that precedes this, and mainly because of the brevity or the short amount of time that I have. I have to really condense this talk, and so that's part of the reason why it's hard for me to like keep my thoughts together, because it's been many years in the making and all that type of stuff. But that'll talk a little bit more about it. So in preparation for this, I wanted to do something a little bit interactive, and since we've only got 10 people in the room, go do this real quick. I'll leave this up here for a second. I wanted to make something interactive and kind of create our own little mass notification system, and so this took a lot of effort. I'll say it got a little bit more complicated than I initially had thought it might be, but the intent in this was, how can I create something that would simulate how we would inject into the system? Because obviously I can't just go off and crack into these systems and do stupid stuff, and you get alerts on your phone that you didn't subscribe to and that type of thing. I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm just saying that we're not going to do that today. But for those that aren't interested in texting and subscribing to something, I promise I'm not going to spam you and that type of deal, because I'm paying per text message to do this. So yeah, if somebody wants to see how many thousands of those they can get, like subscribed or something before the end of this talk and run up my credit card or something, my wife is in the back and she'll thank you a lot for that. For those that don't like, no laughs? There we go. We don't care about your money. I did put up some if this then that. Anybody like if this then that type of thing? Obviously, if you don't use those, then you're probably not going to go sign up for an account real quick or something like that. But really cool service if you like to automate things. So this is also part of the reason why I didn't get a whole lot of sleep and why I'm a little bit frazzled, was because even up until a moment, this happened actually a couple hours ago, the system that you're using that you just, hopefully some of you subscribe to, when I started firing some test alerts, trying to synchronize all this stuff together, because there's a lot of jiggery-pokery behind the scenes to make this little thing work. The wonderful people at this group texting deal decided that I might not be a legitimate person sending like nuclear explosion warnings and things like that. So I got my account frozen, and I may have come up with a workaround. But anybody, you getting the subscribe stuff? Anything? All right, cool. I didn't send anything back? All right, well, oh well. We'll see. This may be a massive failure. I am kind of anticipating that it will be. But so real quick, I'm not going to go through this, but just for some background and for posterity and for the purposes of having the slides up so that somebody can go back and look at them later, the emergency alert system kind of has gone through a bunch of iterations, and it's in the process of going through another one right now. And I covered this in a lot more detail in the previous talks. But so if you're interested in kind of the history of it, there's a lot of stuff and a lot of resources are posted at the end of the talk and in the slides that I have today. But initially it was radio and AM radio and things like that. And so the system was initially conceived as CONELRAD, and the idea was to, how do I, as the president, in the risk of nuclear types of situations, if you think back to the the Cold War and that type of stuff, the intent was to notify the public, that things were going to happen. But more importantly, what this system was about was that AM radio stations were like huge beacons for bombers and missiles and other things to like hone in on in major metropolitan areas. So when you think about a 100,000 watt AM station broadcasting, they would just kind of say like, hone in on that broadcasting thing. So they didn't have GPS location at the time, or laser dot sites and stuff like that. So this system was really intended to, while on the surface was about protecting people, it was more about like allowing the presidential staff to take over radio stations to scramble signals for purposes of confusing bombers and things like that. So there's some history on that. You can go back and read it, but it's going through an iteration now where we see things like the Integrated Public Warning and Alert System, or IPAWS. You'll hear me say IPAWS because that's a mouthful. And then WHEEZ, there are videos on this. The videos from FEMA are absolutely hilarious. But WHEEZ and the Commercial Mobile Alert System, those are those things how you get the Amber Alerts and such on your cell phone. So we won't go into that too much, but obviously we know the emergency broadcast system followed. This is when they started to say, how do we use this for something other than nuclear holocaust, because that's not really as likely anymore. And now we start getting weather alerts and such on television and radio. And the last iteration of this was the what we call the emergency alert system, and that's getting ready to change again. Some acronyms. The INDEC is an encoder-decoder device, and we'll talk about those a little bit. The big other thing, Common Alerting Protocol, and actually that's probably the most important for now. But so the way that this system worked, or works now, is that a message is seeded into a system, and stations listen to other stations, and so forth, and it propagates out into the United States. So anybody play that old game as a kid, Telephone? Where you like whisper a secret and you go around, like if we were to do that, what happens, right? The message on the other end, anybody, somebody in the middle likes to, play a game and do things, yeah. And there are perfect examples of this where like Maury Povich is interrupted by all sorts of crazy stuff. There's some funny, hilarious videos on YouTube. Well, why did this system ultimately, this is kind of what it looks like. And these are slides or pictures from FEMA. It's a friggin' mess, is really what it is. And so as this system has kind of grown in size and scale and that type of thing. I don't even know what this means. It's the craziest thing. So this is actually not for the EAS. This is kind of a discussion for the HasCollect system and stuff like that. But they use the same series of architectures where people listen to other people, and we'll see what happens here in a bit. There's some anecdotal evidence of how successful this stuff is. But we can have some conspiracy theories and stuff like that, but the intent of IPAWS and some of these newer technologies is to actually put the alerts very close and very targeted to you. So down to a particular geographic area, for example, like if there's a flooding notification or something like that, they want to send to just those people that are in that particular area. And so one of the things that I found kind of funny and kind of preparing for this talk was that Folly Beach has a notification system, and you can go and subscribe to it. Most of these systems are facilitated by government-approved third-party commercial companies. So like the Code Red that's down there on the bottom, there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And if for anything else, what I hope this talk shows you is kind of how hilarious this is, that I pretty much stood up in a notification system similar to those. I won't say that it's the same scale or quality or anything else by any means, but in a couple of days was able to stand this up and provide a similar function. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like this. So we've got approved emergency managers, and I say approved because we're not going to talk about social engineering in the context of this, because that would be one way that you might, I don't know, compromise the system, is by attacking the people at that end. But then you've got these IPAWS message aggregators, and then those feed all of the stuff that's downstream. So your traditional emergency alert systems, cellular broadcast, digital EAS, which is very key to this conversation. And then this is my reminder to send something. So did everybody register? If you don't do it now, I'm going to take a break for here just for a second. I know you can't see anything, but we'll go into this in a bit. So, yay, success. All right. So where do we begin? So the first place that I kind of started with this was what is the EAS and what comprises it and things like that. And so I showed this slide just to show, like, there's a bunch of vendors and providers. And so I started by trying to gather some information about what exactly comprised this system and who was on it. And what I found was a lot of this type of stuff. It's hardware, right? When I talk about Internet of Things, well, all this kind of collides to create a big mishmash of insanity. We're going to talk about some crazy, stupid protocols and bad decisions probably in my, and again, caveat emptor, right? This is my opinion solely. But rack-mounted devices and things like that many of these things have been around forever. And so I started out with this next thing, and I was like, well, clearly these are very important devices, and they would never be on the internet, right? Holy crap, it's the USA with chicken pox. This was, so I'm going to give you some practical stuff here. So this is, I kind of had to walk the boundary of what do I give you that you can go do if you really want to find this stuff, and what's just being dumb that is going to obviously enable somebody to really go and do something stupid with this information. But obviously, if it's on the internet, it's not exactly private. So I'm going to put out some things that I use to find them. So a little bit of Shodan and a little bit of Google dorking and a crap load of Google for purposes of finding documentation and reading and all that stuff. And we're going to talk about this, actually, the next slide here. But so around this time last year, before that presentation I gave last year doing the RF stuff, there were about 1,900 systems, almost 2,000 that I found online. That's not to say that all of those are online. Anybody that's ever used Shodan? Anybody? Audience participation. If you haven't, go use it. It's awesome. It's a lot of fun. So using some different things that you can go out there and find, but it's definitely down. But that doesn't mean that that many systems were really online or really available anyways. But one of the things that I was thinking about providing to you guys, and I had, anybody have those people in their lives that are like Evan, or, internally, that's a bad idea, don't do that, no. Which was going to be to release an Nmap script that would actually show you, I may or may not have created, that would actually go and test all the default credentials and things like that on these, because anyways, I don't know why you'd want to do that. But as it turns out, we don't really need to. So OSINT. Every time that I would sit here and start trying to bang on something technically, I would find stuff, and we're going to go through a little bit of a sidebar here, or through this stuff. So the advanced. So I start going around and I'm like, all right, well, let's see where I can find some of these devices. And sure enough, wow, they've got them on eBay. And some of the things and it's not going to let me do it, but serial number and MAC address and all that type of stuff, that may be useful in certain scenarios. And I'm not going to draw too much into that, but obviously this might not be a great thing for these critical devices that are allowed to retrieve messages and other things from the United States government or whoever it may be to alert us of what's been going on, or emergencies that are in our area or that are pertinent to us. But and so then I start to do some additional stuff, and I find these articles like iPause potentially hasn't been exploited. Well, obviously it's too small for you to read, but here I am thinking, ooh, yeah, somebody's a security article, somebody's talking about something. No, what this guy's talking about is they're with this emergency management group, and they're like, man, the potential of this thing is yet to be exploited. I'm like, oh, okay. But then he starts to talk about digital sign systems. Highway departments with big signs could pick up iPause alerts for their area and put them on campuses and other things. And so obviously this is interesting to me. And then I start to find stuff about how fragile the EAS system and some of these devices are, with stuff like this where the FCC fined a company $2 million because they put an EAS message inside of this movie trailer and it triggered equipment all over the United States. Let me think about this for a second. So, spoiler alert, if you go see the other talk on RF, that may be exactly what this is about, which is taking pre-recorded messages or maybe Android apps that help you make joke, prank your friends with this, funny app that you can buy on the Android App Store for $3, that will actually trigger these devices and trigger these systems. And I'm not saying that I bought that thing on eBay, but I may have a couple of these devices, which are not illegal to own. Okay, you can buy them yourself if you want to spend $5,000. So, oh, there we go. I did that one. All right. So fail. So then I start trying to go out there, and I go out to vendors and things like that. And I've got all these lists of vendors. I go to their websites. I'm like, I'm going to download some of the software. I'm going to download documents and manuals. Obviously, OSINT, right? Everybody following my progression of what I'm doing. I'm just trying to get information. How do these things work? And so then I start to find stuff where, obviously, now that there have been some incidents and some accidents and that type of thing, I start to find information on how they're no longer just putting this out on the internet, that you can't just go and download stuff. They want you to be a legitimate person, that you have to have some type of pre-approval to get firmware updates or whatever, kind of typical things, right? Not that they would do a whole lot of good if you had them anyways, other than for maybe some of the stuff that we're going to do in a little bit, that make it a little easier. But then they're not exactly the brightest bulbs in the lamp, or I don't know, insert terrible euphemism. But just by Google searching, I'm finding, based on these vendors, these are the passwords to the encrypted or whatever zip files that they're using and so forth. So these are out on, who knew that listservs were still such valuable sources of information, right? So obviously this is awesome. Well, then I find fun stuff like this. This is one of those, and I alluded to this a moment ago, maybe just attacking the people that are the responsible people that can release the alerts in the first place, who maybe, and what's hard to see down there, temporary, please use the temporary password down below. Here's your ID and login, incident 1, password capital I, incident _1. That's difficult. Oops, this was for con only. I hit the wrong reply button. Ouch. And now it's archived on the internet for posterity. Or we can go into the forums where we find these engineers who are trying to understand, they understand radio and other things really well, but trying to understand how computers and networking work is very hard. And so they're trying to get these new iPause devices that once were not internet accessible, because they've received it over the air from other radio stations. Now they're getting it over the internet, and they're trying to figure out how to put pinholes in their routers. And they may or may not have been nice enough to, post that and help each other out. So maybe you can drop in there and have fun with those guys if you like to troll them. And then I ran into this deal, so I'm starting to find okay, here's the links to get information out. I started was well, how do I connect to FEMA if I wanted to see to interact with these message services and things like that? How do I interact with them? And so I start to find that you can't just even though it's a very complicated technology, it's cutting edge RSS. RSS, right? Yeah, so this brand new iPause system, state of the art, cutting edge RSS. I'm gonna let that sink in for a second. But so we're gonna stop here for a second. We'll do a quick little, hopefully a demo. Whoop. Letting you see something. All right, so I'm sitting here and I'm like, all right, well, I want to connect to, that's going to do that. So I want to connect up to stuff, and this is, hard. But I want to connect up, and I want to see what these feeds are and what these alerts are coming out of FEMA. So and it's kind of tiny. And so I find the URLs. Finding the URLs to this stuff is no problem, right? But every time I try to connect to it, I get this invalid PIN stuff. And so the previous search that I showed you that was a fail, obviously I know it's RSS. I know it's, the basic stuff. And I'm skipping over a lot of research here, but are you still following me? Okay, so I find the feed and that type of thing, and I want to connect up and get alerts and see how these things, what are they releasing? What all kinds of goodies does FEMA not want me to see clearly? Because when I try to go to it, I get this, invalid PIN. So I start Googling for PIN, right? And lo and behold, I find these magical numbers that apparently belong to each vendor that are apparently also embedded in the firmware. We'll just keep moving on. So then I start looking at this, I'm like, obviously this is not a very well-designed type of thing here, but, I start reading I'm like, somebody somewhere had to think about this. So I mentioned there was a guy in here earlier who was talking about Carnegie Mellon, and this whole thing that came to light this week, obviously where they got paid by the who was it, FBI or somebody, $1 million or whatever. I don't know. Anybody know what I'm talking about? All right, Google it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know much about it. I just have seen the headlines and made me laugh because in the context of this. So guess who did the assessment the assessment of risk and strategy and security architecture for this entire thing? The wonderful people of Carnegie Mellon University. I've read it, and other than putting me to sleep a couple of times, the amazing lack of substance in the context that the entire idea was that somebody attacking the FEMA system itself, so attacking iPause as an RSS server. So they put it behind Akamai, and they put it behind all these things. They've got this great architecture of how you can't take it down, and blah, 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 but yet nobody really thought about, and we'll see this here in a moment, there's some major missing things in that, wait a minute, all I'm going to do is attack FEMA. Okay, well, we just saw a moment ago, like, obviously the U.S. with chickenpox. Anybody? I'm going to, like, throw that link back, you know. U.S. with chickenpox. Well, maybe there's some devices out there that are trying to talk to that, so maybe we can talk to those. But so then I find also from our friends at Carnegie Mellon this awesome GitHub repo full of, it's a web client for simple CAP authoring. Then I see CAP collector server to authenticate, sign, aggregate, and forward CAP alerts. That could be fun. So I'm going to take us back to this diagram. So we've got the people up there that we've seen obviously probably aren't necessarily the greatest with, I don't know, security operations or keeping their passwords even off of email lists and so forth that go out to the world. And then the next piece of this is this security around this IPAWS system that, that Carnegie Mellon did, and it's obviously very secure, so I probably ought to leave that alone. But I also saw that, wait a minute, I have this, so maybe, and then I know where all those devices are, that they're out there on the internet, and I have this, so maybe I can make this myself. And so then let's just keep going. So I kind of keep finding some research, and so we talked about it earlier. Previous exploits on the system. Anybody hear about the zombies on the in Montana or whatever that took over a morning radio show? This is back in 2013. Anybody hear about that one? Nobody. So pretty much what happened is that early one morning, a television show or a TV station in Montana somebody apparently breaks in using these keys and so forth, and then later it came out that it wasn't really these SSH keys. It was they had not changed the default credentials on the appliance, and so somebody got in there and released a funny message that then propagated a bit and went out on television stations and so forth. And so shortly after, this got articles in Wired magazine and all this other type of stuff, and I'm just going to call bullcrap because that really, yes, I have validated that vulnerability exists in that version of the firmware release and things like that, but there are so many more awful things that would have been way easier to do. So I kind of take this and I'm like, obviously this would be a fun one to get into, right? This DASDEC appliance or whatever that's part of this particular set of vulnerabilities that IOAct had found. And so I start going out there and like I said earlier, they started locking this stuff up, right? You had to have passwords to get to the firmwares and other things. And so then I find a PDF online from the company that just released this that maybe has the password that I blurred out there, that you can download all of the firmware. And yes, this does still work, so that's why I blurred it out. Not that you can't go and find it. But obviously this is my opinion that this is failing. And then I also had some firmware and some configuration utilities from some of the other vendors that made it possible to, like, wait a minute, what is this, accept bad signature? Why would you put that in there, right? We're only going to talk to FEMA, right? Maybe verify signature. Oh, I can uncheck that. Never mind, it wasn't checked by default anyways. Require a signature even. I can turn all this stuff off. These are features, right? No SSL check. And then I can configure my own. So let's do that. Has anybody received any notifications yet? No? Wow, this is going to suck. All right. So let's do this real quick. So I'm going to show you what I went over here and did a moment ago. So that wonderful software that we talked about a little bit ago, that the people from Carnegie Mellon were so nice to provide to us, I may have stood that up, and that may be something that you can go and interact with. And as I mentioned before, the people at Carnegie Mellon are really great about telling us that we made this, and that this is open source and so forth. So yeah, you can go and play with this if you want to. Django server, I absolutely learned to hate it using this because it sucks, but just, again, my opinion. And then I can create things like this, RSS feeds that are CAP compliant and so forth. So let's look at how difficult it is with this software now to create a message. I want to issue a new alert, And you know, of all the things I can say, is this actual? Is it a test? Should I make that a little bigger? You guys see it okay? You know, is this an actual alert? What is this? I'm gonna say that this is actual. You know, who do I want to release it to? Private, public, restricted. So all this is part of this standard that was created around these emergency notifications. And you can go in and create all sorts of nifty stuff. I'm going to save us some time, and I'll just create another one here that you know, that you can make templates and so forth, and do all sorts of fun things. Hazard threat, make preparations, do whatever. How long you want it to last. Then you've got to do things like who's issuing this alert. Obviously, this is very difficult to put text in a box, right? Anybody, did I lose you already? I know that it's the afternoon and I'm not really making a whole lot of sense at this point anyways. It's fine, all right. All right, I'm dragging this out. Is that what this is? Okay. We hate you, Evan. So anyways, I'm going to
put it in my phone what you got on the screen.
Oh, yeah, alert.pentestfail.com. You are more than welcome to go there. And so then this is kind of a fun thing. I'm going to zoom this out just a little bit so it's easier to kind of interact with. They provide this mechanism. So I mentioned before that the idea behind the system is to create geolocation, you know, very specific, targeted alerts that can be released by local authorities and so forth. And so the idea with this system is that they can, you know, a county or a city or even that level can issue alerts that just go to their particular area of authorization. So, you know, in that context, geoinformation becomes kind of important to some of these alerts. And so their utility had to create, you know, this is very complicated, you know, who receives this alert? Everybody. Let's just send it to the whole friggin' world if I wanted to, because what ends up happening is that as systems receive this, the idea behind the system is that pretty much everybody receives the alerts. Okay, so every system receives it, and based on codes and other things that are in it that are either, you know, what type of message it is and other things, they're programmed what to do with it. You know, if it's an alert for Alabama and I'm an EAS system sitting in Georgia, I don't care about it, so I'm not going to replay it. But it's in the configuration, and it's in those GUIs and other things that I showed you, you know, very briefly earlier. And I talk about this a little bit more in the previous talk. I really don't have the time to dig into it and talk and show some of the rest of this, but because I'm running short on time already. But the idea is that everybody would receive this. They would filter it out based on their policy, and so because of that, it's rampant for misconfiguration. And so, what'd I forget? Oh. So I'm going to create a, I can even do multiple areas and so forth. I didn't even realize that. Learn something new every time. So then it gives me the output of this. That'll be helpful. Maybe I'll stop stuttering or something. Clearly I have a problem. So this is what it looks like. And so like I said, this is, I didn't talk about this much just because I don't really think it's that important, but is anybody familiar with Oasis? They're one of kind of like IETF in a manner of speaks, but Oasis, they manage a lot of different standards and things like that. So they're responsible for this protocol and the fields and the format and other things. So this is a regulated type of thing, so that's why we know that it will work everywhere. And the idea behind this is that you have to digitally sign these messages and so forth, that whoever's releasing them is approved. And I know that this is a little small. So I'm going to release an alert. And so we see this, you know, valid. I don't know what I just did, but sorry, guys. It more or less what it said was that, yes, your credentials are correct. It's signed. It's authenticated, so on and so forth. And so that's where that stuff in the system came back from, like trust the, you know, digitally. And that's where the FEMA and Carnegie Mellon, they have in the base context and of how they built the system, that the idea is that it's going to do a validation on these signatures, like who signed that message, who created it, and do I trust that, and so forth. Well, clearly, in this instance, I don't really have to worry about that because I'm standing up my own. I'm not pretending to be FEMA at this point. I'm alerts.pentestfail.com, and it may or may not be trivial to go and find some of those devices and just add those configurations to them. I know I'm kind of skipping around here a little bit, but there's not really a good flow of like exactly. It didn't come in one solid stream of stuff, right? This was a lot of research over a lot of time. But now I've released another alert, and I see that this feed gets updated. Well, the way that those systems and all the other devices work is they poll this RSS feed at an interval. And once they get it, they pull the information in, they decide what to do with it based on their configuration, and they release the alert or not. Well, like I said, now I've got my own IPAW server that Carnegie Mellon was so nice to provide to me for free, even, under a BSD license. And now I may or may not be able to find and fingerprint those devices, which you now have some of the stuff that shows how you might go and find them. And if you're creative, you may try some of the default credentials for some of these and probably get into a lot of them. I'm not going to say exactly how many. I'm not going to say that that even happened. What am I talking about? Clearly, I'm delirious. But so let's go back. So make sure I didn't skip over something here. I didn't. I didn't. Whatever. See, I'm going to have a couple extra minutes. So I kind of skipped over something because I didn't know how much time I was going to have if I could dig into this or not. But some of the research we're about to dig into in a moment would not be possible if not for Tom, who had to leave a bit ago. He was here and wasn't able to stay. But also my buddy James. Both of them are kind of my couple of mentors that helped me a lot. So things like, anybody know what a lexicographical or a Lex analyzer is, or like Lex code and things like that? So some of these, yeah, go ask your elders because I had to do the same thing. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. They're just things that we don't, it's the concept of taking machine-based code and that, anyways, go Google it. You'll see it and it'll blow your mind. The idea of like multi-stage compiling. Anybody? Okay, so that's really what Lex is. It's a stage in compiling code, and anyways, that's about where my level of knowledge stops. So to reverse engineer some of the firmware and some of the utilities and other things that I found, I then had to rely on some of my mentors to be able to help me reverse engineer it so that we could show you some of the stuff that we're going to show you here in a second. So with that being said, I've got more links and references in here than I've ever had in any other talk because there's just tons and tons and tons of resources and tons and tons and tons of information that's available to this. And I'm going to throw this last slide up here, and then what I'll do is I'm going to stop the recording once, unless we have any questions or anything real quick. But I'm going to show you, so all of that effort to, and you can keep it going for just a second, but all of that effort that went into, now that we've stood up the system and now that we've fingerprinted them and we know where they are and that type of thing, what are some other mechanisms that we could use to potentially control them? So we know that there are vulnerabilities, that there have been patches for them. There's US CERT releases and things like that from the DASDEC, from the IO active vulnerabilities that they found. But there may or may not be like a few hundred others that could potentially be exploited, which I'm not going to video or talk about in that context. But any questions? I know that this hasn't made a whole lot of sense, and this is probably one of the crappiest talks I've ever given, but I'm not exactly impressive by any means. So
my fault. I should have given you the beer earlier.
yeah, that would.
Plus, you're editing this. It's
Yeah.
gonna be like Star Wars: The New Hope. After you finish.
Yeah, I'm going to be like that kid, with the golf ball retriever. Yeah,
A lot of people using Carnegie's servers. Is that what you found?
So the thing is, like, because of how you retrieve it, there's not really a way to know. I would say that the majority of people are not. Most of it's commercial, so most of the stuff that's out there, and the question was, I guess, for video purposes, was are a lot of people using the Carnegie Mellon software? And I think the reason was that that Carnegie Mellon kind of was tasked or asked to write it or something like that was that most of those systems are really expensive. Because I looked at just subscribing to one of them and making my own campus area alert system or something like that and push things out to televisions and all this other type of stuff. And the reality was that I couldn't do it in the time frame because they have all sorts of approval processes. That and the setup fees for them are insanely expensive. These are not inexpensive things. So like the Code Red deal that Folly Beach has and stuff like that, they're trying to do, so most of the system is just like, it's based on the idea that they're going to do all of the vetting up front, that you have to be a vetted person, that you can't just release these alerts, or that the people that are important aren't going to do it. Again, what I was hoping to demonstrate was that, so what? Most of those people are idiots anyways. They don't know a whole lot about security. I'm sorry, I'm definitely going to have to edit the video now because I'm going to get trolled on this. Like, Evan just called those people stupid. But yeah, it's not even about being stupid. It's about any number of mistakes that get made that I accidentally reply to all with a password or something like that, that then goes out and gets shared and can be found and used. And so we just know from reality that that's not very good. But some of the additional OSINT from like research, or like where they were doing working groups to determine how they were going to do and organize, the agendas to deploy the system to the United States, they list every single person from every single state that's part of their emergency management divisions and who's in charge of it and who's this. You got their emails and their phone numbers and their addresses and all this stuff because these are all government documents. So it may or may not be fairly trivial to, I now have the entire list of people that I'm going to start sending phishing emails to, for example. So the reality is that that's just not a very sound strategy. And so never mind the fact that the system itself isn't particularly well architected to, while it may be very resilient for emergency purposes, it's definitely not very secure from a technology standpoint. And so, on that note, any other questions? Death threats? General insults? Yeah. I just woke up. What do you want? No. All right, so with that, thank you. Stop the video, and I'm going to show something real quick.